The sound of 240 soldiers snapping to attention echoed across the parade ground like a thunderclap, boots hitting concrete in perfect unison. But Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez wasn't looking at the sea of green uniforms arranged in neat rows before her. Her dark eyes were locked on Colonel Marcus Brennan as he approached the podium, his chest heavy with ribbons that told stories of wars she'd never been allowed to fight in, despite being twice the soldier most of his officers would ever be, preparing. And narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton, and the air still held that crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind. Elena stood at attention in the front row, her spine straight as a rifle barrel, her uniform pressed to perfection. At 28, she'd earned every stripe on her sleeve through blood, sweat, and the determination that had carried her through 7 years of military service. Her grandmother's silver cross hung beneath her uniform shirt, a reminder of the woman who'd taught her that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about how many times you got back up. "Soldiers of the 82nd, Colonel Brennan's voice boomed across the formation, amplified by the microphone clipped to his collar. His pale blue eyes swept the crowd with the confidence of a man who'd never had his authority questioned. "Today we celebrate excellence in our ranks. Today we honor those who embody the values that make our unit the finest fighting force in the world." Elena's best friend, Corporal Maria Santos, stood 3 soldiers to her left. Maria had been there the night Elena had first confided about the colonel's special meetings, the way his hand lingered too long when he handed her assignments, the comments about how a woman like her could advance quickly with the right kind of cooperation. Maria's jaw was set tight now, her usually warm brown eyes hard with the kind of anger that came from watching someone you loved being hunted by a predator who wore the same uniform you did. Behind them, in the 3rd row, stood Sergeant First Class David Park, Elena's squad leader and mentor. David had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had seen enough injustice to last several lifetimes, but he'd also seen enough good soldiers destroyed by corrupt leadership to know when something was fundamentally wrong. He'd been watching the colonel's behavior toward Elena for months, documenting everything he could. Knowing that someday the truth would demand to be heard, the colonel continued his speech, speaking of honor and integrity while his eyes periodically found Elena in the crowd. Each time their gazes met, she felt a familiar chill run down her spine, not fear, exactly, but the heightened awareness of prey that knows it's being stalked. She'd grown up in East Los Angeles where predators came in different uniforms, wore the same hungry expressions. She knew that look, knew what it meant, and knew that Colonel Marcus Brennan was building towards something that would force her to choose between her career and her dignity. "The Army values we live by," Brennan continued, his voice carrying easily across the silent formation: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. These aren't just words printed on a card you carry in your wallet. They're the foundation upon which every decision we make must rest. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. She fingered the small digital recorder hidden in her breast pocket, a device David had given her 3 weeks ago, when the colonel's behavior had escalated from inappropriate comments to demands for private meetings. That always seemed to occur after hours, in locations where no witnesses would be present. The recorder had been her insurance policy, her way of fighting back in a system that, too, often protected the predators and punished the prey. The ceremony dragged on for another 20 minutes, with awards presented and speeches about unit cohesion and the importance of maintaining standards. Elena watched it all with growing unease, noting how the colonel's speech seemed designed to emphasize chain of command, the importance of following orders without question, and the severe consequences that awaited those who brought unfounded accusations against their superiors. When the formation was finally dismissed, Soldiers began to disperse in the organized chaos that followed every large gathering. Elena was gathering her gear when she heard her name called over the din of conversation and movement. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez." Colonel Brennan's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "A word, if you please." Maria shot Elena a look of pure alarm, but Elena simply nodded and made her way toward where the colonel stood, apart from the other officers who were engaged in their own conversations. As she approached, she noticed that he'd positioned himself near the equipment shed, a location that would provide cover from the view of most of the dispersing soldiers. "Sir?" Elena came to attention, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. "At ease, Staff Sergeant." Brennan's voice was different now, lower, more intimate. "I wanted to discuss your upcoming evaluation. There are some areas where I think you could show significant improvement." Elena's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the recorder in her pocket, making sure it was positioned correctly. "I'm always interested in feedback that will help me serve more effectively, sir." The colonel stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of whiskey on his breath. It was barely past noon. "I think you know what I'm talking about, Elena. We've had this conversation before." "I'm afraid I don't follow, sir." Elena's voice remained professionally neutral, but every muscle in her body was coiling like a spring. She'd been through this dance before, knew how it would escalate, knew what he would eventually demand in exchange for a positive evaluation, a promotion, or simply the absence of trumped-up charges that could destroy her career. "Don't play dumb with me." Brennan's voice took on an edge that made Elena's combat instincts flare to life. "You're a smart woman. Smart enough to know that your future in this army depends on how well you cooperate with your superiors." Around them, the parade ground was emptying as soldiers headed to their next assignments. Elena was acutely aware that in moments, they would be alone except for whatever witnesses might be visible from the windows of nearby buildings. She knew this was the moment she'd been preparing for, the confrontation that had been building for months. "Colonel, if you have concerns about my performance, I'd appreciate the opportunity to address them through proper channels." Elena kept her voice level, professional, giving him every opportunity to back down and pretend this conversation had never taken a darker turn. Instead, Brennan reached out and placed his hand on her arm, his fingers tightening just enough to make it clear this wasn't a casual gesture. "I don't think you're hearing me, Staff Sergeant. Your evaluation is due next week. Your promotion board is next month. A lot could go wrong for a soldier who doesn't understand how to be grateful for the opportunity she's been given." Elena looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up into his pale blue eyes. In that moment, she saw everything that was wrong with the system that protected predators because they wore eagles on their shoulders and had learned to speak the language of honor while practicing the art of corruption. She thought of her grandmother, who'd raised her to never bow down to anyone who mistook kindness for weakness. She thought of Maria, watching from somewhere nearby, probably torn between following orders to disperse and staying close enough to help if needed. She thought of David, who'd trusted her with evidence and taught her that sometimes the only way to stop injustice was to face it head-on. Consequences be damned. "Sir, I need you to remove your hand from my arm." Elena's voice carried a warning that anyone who'd served in combat would have recognized immediately. It was the tone soldiers used in the seconds before violence became inevitable. But Colonel Marcus Brennan had never served in combat. He'd spent his career in staff positions and garrison commands, advancing through political connections and the kind of backroom deals that kept him far from any situation where his leadership would be tested under fire. He didn't recognize the warning in Elena's voice. He saw only a young woman who needed to be taught her place in his version of military hierarchy. His grip tightened. "I don't think you understand the position you're in, Staff Sergeant. You're going to come with me to my office and we're going to have a more detailed discussion about your attitude problem." That's when Elena noticed they weren't alone. Maria had positioned herself near the corner of the equipment shed, close enough to see what was happening, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability. David was approaching from the direction of the parking area, his movements casual, but purposeful. And there, standing near the windows of the battalion headquarters building, at least a dozen other soldiers had paused in whatever they were doing to watch the interaction between their colonel and one of their most respected non-commissioned officers. The stage was set, the audience was in place, and Colonel Marcus Brennan was about to learn a lesson that 7 years of military service had taught Elena Vasquez. Some battles choose you, whether you're ready or not. Elena looked once more at the hand gripping her arm, then raised her eyes to meet Brennan's gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet enough that only he could hear her, but it carried the weight of every woman who'd ever been told to smile pretty and play a long while. Predators hiding behind authority slowly destroyed their lives. "Sir, you have exactly 3 seconds to let go of me before I show you why they call me the best hand-to-hand combat instructor in this battalion." Brennan's response was to laugh, a short, ugly sound that revealed just how little he understood about the woman standing in front of him. "Is that a threat, Staff Sergeant?" "No, sir," Elena replied, her grandmother's silver cross pressing against her chest as she shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, moving into a stance that would allow her to react to whatever came next. That was a warning. Elena had been awake since 0430, same as every morning for the past 7 years. Her apartment off base was spartanly furnished but spotlessly clean, with a small kitchen table where she ate her breakfast while reading intelligence briefings and unit updates. The walls held only a few personal items, her grandmother's rosary hanging next to her bed, a photo of her family from her last leave, and her certificates of completion from airborne school, ranger school, and the combat instructor course that had made her one of the youngest female sergeants to earn that particular qualification. The morning routine never varied. PT at 0530, shower and uniform preparation, a protein bar and black coffee for breakfast while she reviewed the training schedule she'd prepared for her squad. Elena had learned early in her military career that excellence was not just expected, it was survival. Women in combat arms were still relatively rare, still viewed with skepticism by some of the old guard, still required to prove themselves worthy of respect that was automatically granted to their male counterparts. She'd grown up understanding that the world demanded more from people who looked like her. Her mother, Carmen, had worked 2 jobs to keep Elena and her younger brother in school and out of trouble in a neighborhood where both were constant challenges. Her father had left when Elena was 12, unable to handle the pressure of providing for a family in a place where legitimate opportunities were scarce and illegitimate ones carried consequences that destroyed more lives than they improved. It was her grandmother, Esperanza, who'd shaped the woman Elena had become. Esperanza had survived the Depression, World War II rationing, and the death of 2 husbands while raising 5 children on her own. She'd taught Elena that strength wasn't something you borrowed from others. It was something you built inside yourself, one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one refusal to surrender your dignity at a time. "Mia," she'd said during one of their last conversations before Elena deployed to her first assignment, "the world will try to make you smaller than you are. It will try to convince you that you don't belong in places where you have every right to be. But you remember this, you carry the strength of every woman who came before you, every woman who fought so you could stand where you're standing. Don't you ever let anyone make you forget that." Elena thought about those words now as she laced up her combat boots, preparing for another day of walking the tightrope between competence and compliance that defined military life for women like her. The truth was, she loved being a soldier. She loved the challenge, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose that came from serving something larger than herself. She was good at it, better than good actually. Her soldiers respected her because she never asked them to do anything she wouldn't do herself, and she'd proven time and again that she could outshoot, outrun, and outfight most of the men in her unit. But loving something didn't make it easy. And being excellent at something didn't protect you from the predators who saw that excellence as either a threat to be eliminated or a prize to be claimed. The problems with Colonel Brennan had started subtly, the way these things always did. A comment about how she looked in her dress uniform. A hand that lingered too long during a handshake. Assignments that required her to work late, alone, in locations where casual encounters could be engineered. Elena had recognized the pattern because she'd seen it before, both in the military and in the civilian world. Men in positions of power who used that power to extract tribute from women who needed their approval to advance, to survive, to simply exist in spaces where they were already fighting an uphill battle for acceptance. For months, she'd tried to handle it the way she'd been trained to handle most challenges, with professionalism, documentation, and hope that the system would work the way it was supposed to work. She'd reported the incidents through proper channels, filed complaints with the appropriate authorities, and waited for justice to arrive in the form of official investigations and corrective action. But the system had failed her the way it failed so many others. Investigations were conducted by officers who'd served with Brennan for years, who'd advanced their own careers through his recommendations, who had too much invested in maintaining the status quo to seriously challenge his behavior. Elena's complaints were deemed unsubstantiated, her concerns labeled as misunderstandings, her requests for transfer denied due to critical personnel shortages. Meanwhile, Brennan's behavior had escalated. The comments became more explicit, the unwanted contact more frequent, the threats more overt. He'd made it clear that her future in the Army depended on her willingness to provide the kind of special cooperation that had nothing to do with military service and everything to do with the abuse of power that corrupt leaders had practiced since the beginning of human civilization. Elena had found herself caught between impossible choices. She could submit to his demands and sacrifice her integrity while enabling him to victimize others. She could continue fighting through official channels that had already proven themselves unwilling or unable to protect her. Or she could accept that sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to make the cost of predation higher than the rewards. The decision to start recording their interactions had come after a particularly disturbing encounter 3 weeks earlier. Brennan had cornered her in his office after duty hours, ostensibly to discuss her upcoming evaluation. Instead, he'd spent 20 minutes detailing exactly what he expected from her in exchange for a favorable report, using language that would have resulted in immediate dismissal for any soldier who used it toward a civilian. When Elena had tried to leave, he'd blocked her path to the door and made it clear that refusing his demands would result in negative counseling statements, poor evaluation reports, and eventually separation from the military, under circumstances that would make it impossible for her to find employment in her chosen field. The threat was delivered with the calm professionalism of a man who'd practiced this particular form of coercion many times before. That night, Elena had called her grandmother for the first time in months. Esperanza was 83 now, living in a retirement community in Phoenix, but her voice still carried the strength that had sustained their family through decades of struggle. "Tell me what's wrong, Mia," her grandmother had said, somehow sensing Elena's distress across thousands of miles of telephone wire. Elena had found herself crying for the first time since basic training, pouring out the story of harassment, failed complaints, and impossible choices while her grandmother listened with the patient attention she'd always given to problems that seemed insurmountable. "You know what you have to do," Esperanza had said when Elena finished. "You've always known. The question is whether you trust yourself enough to do it. But abuela, if I fight back, I could lose everything. My career, my benefits, my future, everything I've worked for could be gone. Mia, her grandmother's voice carried the weight of 8 decades of hard-won wisdom. Let me tell you something about losing everything. You can lose your job, your money, your house, even your freedom. But the one thing nobody can take from you, unless you give it to them, is your dignity. And once you give that away, everything else you think you're protecting becomes worthless. Anyway, Elena had spent the rest of that night walking the perimeter of the base, thinking about dignity and courage and the difference between surviving and living. She'd thought about the other women in her unit, younger soldiers who looked up to her for guidance and protection. She'd thought about the message it sent when predators were allowed to operate with impunity, while their victims were told to be grateful for small mercies and patient, with a system that prioritized institutional reputation over individual justice. By morning, she'd made her decision. If the system wouldn't protect her, she'd protect herself. If official channels wouldn't deliver justice, she'd find another way. If Colonel Marcus Brennan wanted to turn their professional relationship into a battlefield, she'd show him exactly what kind of warrior he'd chosen to fight. The recording device David had given her was smaller than a matchbook, with enough memory to capture hours of conversation and sophisticated enough to filter out background noise while maintaining crystal clear audio quality. Elena had sewn it into the lining of her uniform pocket, positioned where it could capture conversations while remaining completely hidden from casual observation. For 3 weeks, she documented every inappropriate comment, every veiled threat, every instance of the behavior that Brennan seemed convinced he could practice without consequences. The recordings painted a picture of systematic harassment, abuse of authority, and the kind of corrupt leadership that destroyed unit cohesion and betrayed the trust that soldiers placed in their commanders. But Elena knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Too many complaints had been buried. Too many investigations had concluded with findings that protected the system at the expense of justice. She needed something more, something that would force accountability in a way that couldn't be ignored, dismissed, or swept under the bureaucratic carpet that had hidden so many other instances of command misconduct. Standing on the parade ground that morning, watching Brennan deliver his speech about honor and integrity while planning his next assault on her dignity, Elena had realized that the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The colonel had made his choice to escalate their conflict into something that could no longer be handled through whispered conversations and midnight phone calls to sympathetic friends. Now it was her turn to choose. The 3 seconds Elena had given Colonel Brennan stretched into eternity, measured not in heartbeats, but in the collective intake of breath from the soldiers who'd stopped pretending they weren't watching. Maria had taken a step closer, her hand moving instinctively toward the radio on her belt. David was now openly approaching, his expression shifting from concern to the kind of focused alertness that combat veterans never entirely lose. Colonel Brennan's response to Elena's warning was everything she'd expected and nothing she'd hoped for. Instead of releasing her arm, his grip tightened until she could feel his fingernails digging through the fabric of her uniform. His face moved closer to hers, close enough that she could see the broken capillaries around his eyes, smell the whiskey that explained why his morning speech had carried an extra edge of belligerence. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "I think you've forgotten who you're talking to. I think you need a reminder about how chain of command works in the United States Army." Elena felt the familiar calm that had carried her through 7 years of military service, through combat training exercises where failure meant injury, and through situations where split-second decisions determined whether soldiers lived or died. It was the same calm she'd discovered as a teenager growing up in East LA, when backing down meant becoming a victim and standing up meant accepting whatever consequences came with defending yourself. "Sir, this is your last opportunity to let go of me and walk away." Elena's voice was steady, professional, and loud enough to be heard by anyone within 30 feet. She wanted witnesses. She needed witnesses. What was about to happen would change everything for both of them, and she needed people to see exactly how it started and why it became inevitable. That's when Brennan made the mistake that would define the rest of his military career and end Elena's career crisis in a way none of them could have predicted. Instead of listening to the warning in her voice, instead of recognizing the danger in her stance, instead of understanding that he was facing someone who'd been pushed beyond the point where submission remained an option, he decided to escalate. His free hand moved to her shoulder, gripping hard enough to leave bruises, and he began trying to force her toward the equipment shed, toward the isolation where he could continue this conversation without the complication of witnesses. His voice, when he spoke, carried the arrogant certainty of someone who'd never faced serious consequences for his actions. "You're coming with me, Staff Sergeant, right now. And when we get to my office, you're going to remember exactly what respect looks like." Elena had trained for moments like this, though she'd never imagined applying those skills against a superior officer on a military installation in front of hundreds of potential witnesses. The Army had taught her 17 different ways to disarm an opponent, 12 methods for escaping various holds and restraints, and enough about leverage and anatomy to incapacitate someone twice her size without causing permanent injury. More importantly, growing up in a neighborhood where predators came in all shapes and sizes had taught her the most crucial lesson of all. When someone puts their hands on you against your will, when they try to use physical force to take you somewhere you don't want to go, the time for negotiation has ended and the time for action has arrived. The movement Elena made was so quick and precise that most of the watching soldiers didn't see exactly what happened. One moment Colonel Brennan was gripping her arm and shoulder, trying to force her toward the shed. The next moment he was on his knees on the concrete, his right arm twisted at an angle that made several observers wince in sympathetic pain. His face contorted in shock and agony as he realized that the woman he'd been trying to intimidate had just demonstrated why she held instructor certifications in hand-to-hand combat. The sound he made wasn't quite a scream, but it was loud enough to be heard across the entire parade ground. The crack of his ulna breaking was audible to anyone within 20 feet, a sharp report that cut through the morning air like a gunshot, and brought every conversation in the area to an immediate halt. Elena maintained the hold for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make her point, not long enough to cause unnecessary additional injury. When she released him, Brennan collapsed forward, cradling his broken arm against his chest while making sounds that contained no words, only the kind of raw anguish that comes when someone who's never experienced real consequences suddenly discovers what they feel like. The silence that followed was absolute. 240 soldiers, dozens of whom had been dealing with harassment, abuse, or corruption in various forms, stood frozen in place as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, one of the most respected non-commissioned officers in the battalion, had just broken her commanding officer's arm in front of God, the Army, and anyone else who happened to be watching. Maria was the first to move, breaking into a run toward Elena's position while simultaneously keying her radio. "Battalion Aid Station, this is Corporal Santos. We need medical assistance at the parade ground immediately. Officer down with what appears to be a broken arm." David arrived at almost the same time, his expression carefully neutral as he took in the scene. Colonel Brennan writhing on the ground, Elena standing at attention with blood on her uniform where Brennan's fingernails had torn the fabric, and at least 50 soldiers who'd witnessed the entire encounter from start to finish. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," David said, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that indicated he was already thinking several moves ahead. "I need you to remain exactly where you are until the MPs arrive. Don't say anything to anyone, except to answer direct questions from investigating officers." Elena nodded, her hands clasped behind her back in the parade rest position. She could feel adrenaline beginning to course through her system, but her training kept her centered, focused on what would happen next rather than what had just happened. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a choice that would redefine her entire future in ways she couldn't yet predict. But as she looked down at Colonel Brennan, still moaning and cradling his broken arm, she felt no regret. Only the strange peace that comes when you finally stop running from a fight that was always going to find you anyway. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that word of the incident was already spreading through the base communications network. Within minutes, the parade ground would be swarming with military police, medical personnel, and investigating officers trying to piece together exactly what had happened between a respected staff sergeant and her commanding officer. Elena's hand moved automatically to the recorder in her pocket, making sure it was still running, still documenting everything that was being said and done in the aftermath of her decision to fight back. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had prepared for it as carefully as she'd prepared for any other mission. The Army had given her. The difference was that this mission was personal. This mission was about more than following orders or completing objectives set by someone else. This mission was about proving that some things were worth fighting for, even when fighting back meant risking everything you'd worked to achieve. As the first military police vehicle pulled up to the parade ground, Elena straightened her shoulders and prepared to face whatever consequences came next. She'd made her choice. She'd drawn her line in the sand. And she'd proven to anyone who'd been watching that Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez was exactly the kind of soldier who'd break a predator's arm in front of 240 witnesses rather than submit to the kind of corruption that destroyed everything the uniform was supposed to represent. The war was just beginning. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison arrived on the scene 12 minutes after the first MP vehicle, her expression grim as she surveyed the chaos that had transformed what should have been a routine awards ceremony into what was clearly going to be one of the most investigated incidents in Fort Braxton's recent history. Morrison was the battalion's second-in-command, a career officer with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for fairness that had earned respect from enlisted personnel and fellow officers alike. She'd been in her office reviewing budget reports when the first radio calls started coming in. Officer down at parade ground. Request immediate medical response. Needs CID notification for incident involving command personnel. Each message had added another layer of concern until Morrison realized she was dealing with something far more serious than the typical training accident or disciplinary issue. Now, standing 30 feet from where Colonel Brennan was being loaded into an ambulance, his broken arm immobilized in a temporary splint while medics prepared him for transport to the base hospital, Morrison was trying to piece together a situation that defied easy explanation. According to preliminary reports from the MPs who'd arrived first on scene, Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez had assaulted her commanding officer in front of dozens of witnesses, inflicting injuries that required immediate medical attention. But Morrison had worked with Elena Vasquez for 2 years, had observed her leadership style, her professionalism, and her reputation among the soldiers she supervised. Elena wasn't the kind of NCO who lost control, who allowed personal conflicts to escalate into physical violence, who would risk her career over petty disputes or personality conflicts. If Elena had felt compelled to break her commanding officer's arm in front of half the battalion, there had to be a reason that went far beyond anything Morrison had seen in the official reports. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Morrison approached Elena, who'd maintained her position at parade rest throughout the medical response and initial police interviews. I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning. You have the right to remain silent and the right to legal representation. Do you understand these rights? Elena nodded. Yes, ma'am. I understand my rights and I waive them at this time. I'm prepared to make a full statement regarding the events that led to this incident. Morrison studied Elena's face, noting the torn fabric on her uniform sleeve, the scratches on her arm that suggested she'd been grabbed forcefully, and the absolutely calm expression of someone who'd made a decision and was prepared to live with The consequences. Very well. Sergeant Park, I want you to accompany us as a witness and advisor to Staff Sergeant Vasquez. David stepped forward, his notebook already in hand. Ma'am, I think you should know that this incident didn't occur in isolation. Staff Sergeant Vasquez has been documenting a pattern of harassment and inappropriate behavior for several months. What kind of documentation? Morrison's tone sharpened. If Elena had been building a case against Brennan, if there was evidence of misconduct that had gone unreported through proper channels, then this incident took on an entirely different character. Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew the small recording device, holding it out for Morrison to see. Ma'am, I have audio recordings of multiple conversations with Colonel Brennan in which he engaged in sexual harassment, abuse of authority, and threats of retaliation if I didn't comply with his demands for inappropriate personal favors. Morrison stared at the device, suddenly understanding that she was dealing with something far more complex than a simple assault case. If Elena's recordings contained evidence of command misconduct, if Brennan had been using his position to coerce subordinates, then everything about this incident would need to be re-examined through the lens of self-defense rather than insubordination. Long have you been recording these conversations? Morrison asked. 3 weeks, ma'am. But the behavior I've documented has been ongoing for approximately 8 months. Elena's voice remained steady, professional, but Morrison could hear the underlying steel that suggested she'd prepared for this moment with the same thoroughness she brought to every other military task. Around them, the parade ground was beginning to return to some semblance of normalcy as MPs cordoned off the immediate area and soldiers were directed to return to their regular duties. But Morrison knew that word of what had happened here would spread through the base within hours, carried by the kind of informal communication network that existed in every military unit. The story would grow with each telling. The female staff sergeant who'd broken her commanding officer's arm in front of hundreds of witnesses. Some versions would portray Elena as a hero standing up to an abusive commander. Others would paint her as an insubordinate soldier who'd assaulted a superior officer. The truth, Morrison was beginning to realize, probably lay somewhere in between, in the gray area where institutional failures created situations that could only be resolved through the kind of dramatic action that left everyone involved changed forever. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Morrison said, making a decision that would either vindicate her judgment or end her own career. I want you to know that your allegations will be investigated thoroughly and fairly. If you have evidence of misconduct by Colonel Brennan, that evidence will be heard by people who have the authority to act on it. Elena met Morrison's eyes. Ma'am, I never wanted it to come to this. I tried to handle the situation through proper channels. I filed complaints, requested transfers, documented everything according to regulations. But the system failed to protect NE, and Colonel Brennan's behavior continued to escalate. What was the immediate trigger for today's incident? Morrison asked. Elena's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a note of finality that suggested she'd rehearsed this explanation many times in her mind. Colonel Brennan grabbed my arm and attempted to force me to accompany him to a private location where he could continue what he called our discussion about my attitude problem. When I told him to release me, he tightened his grip and made physical contact with my shoulder in an attempt to control my movement. At that point, I defended myself using the minimum force necessary to escape from his control. Morrison nodded slowly. If Elena's version of events could be substantiated, if the recordings contained the kind of evidence she claimed, then what had happened on the parade ground wasn't an assault. It was self-defense against a superior officer who'd been abusing his authority for months. The implications were staggering. An investigation of this magnitude would involve Criminal Investigation Division agents, Inspector General inquiries, and probably congressional oversight if the media became involved. Careers would be ended, reputations destroyed. and institutional credibility damaged in ways that would take years to repair. But Morrison had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution and uphold the values of military service, and those values demanded that justice be served regardless of rank, regardless of political consequences, regardless of institutional embarrassment. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Morrison said, "you're going to be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of these allegations. I want you to understand that this investigation will be thorough, fair, and conducted by personnel who have no personal relationship with either you or Colonel Brennan." Elena nodded. "I understand, ma'am. I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation." As they walked toward the battalion headquarters building, Morrison found herself thinking about the broader implications of what she'd just witnessed. Elena Vasquez had made a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of leadership and accountability throughout their organization. The question now was whether the system would prove worthy of the courage she'd shown in forcing this confrontation into the open. The conference room in the Criminal Investigation Division building felt like a courtroom, even though Elena knew the real legal proceedings wouldn't begin for weeks. SID Special Agent Catherine Reynolds sat across from her, a digital recorder between them alongside Elena's own device, while Major Patricia Chun from the Judge Advocate General's office took notes in the corner. Through the window, Elena could see the base continuing its daily operations, soldiers moving between buildings with the purposeful efficiency that characterized military life even in the midst of scandal. It had been 6 days since the incident on the parade ground. 6 days of administrative leave, of waiting for phone calls that would determine her future, of watching news reports that had somehow picked up the story of a female staff sergeant who'd broken her commanding officer's arm in front of 240 witnesses. The media narrative was predictably polarized. Elena was either a hero standing up against military sexual assault, or a dangerous soldier who'd violently attacked a superior officer. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than any headline could capture. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Agent Reynolds began, her voice professionally neutral, "we've completed our preliminary review of the recordings you provided. Before we proceed with your formal statement, I want to give you another opportunity to secure legal representation." Elena shook her head. "Ma'am, I've reviewed my rights multiple times. I understand the potential consequences of making a statement without counsel present. But I also understand that the truth is my best defense, and I want this investigation to have access to every detail that might help you understand what really happened." Agent Reynolds nodded and activated her recorder. "This is SEED Special Agent Catherine Reynolds, conducting an interview with Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez regarding the incident of October 15th at approximately 11:45 hours on the Fort Braxton Parade Ground. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, please state your full name and unit for the record." "Elena Maria Vasquez, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 82nd Airborne Division." "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I'm going to play excerpts from the recordings you provided and ask you to provide context for each conversation. The first recording is dated September 23rd, approximately 3 weeks before the incident in question." The sound of Elena's own voice filled the room, professional and measured. "Sir, you wanted to see me about the training schedule for next week?" Then Brennan's voice, carrying an undertone that made Major Chun look up from her notes. "Close the door. Elena, what we need to discuss requires privacy." Elena listened to her recorded self explaining the training requirements while Brennan's responses grew increasingly personal, increasingly inappropriate. She remembered that conversation with perfect clarity, the way he'd positioned himself between her and the door, the casual comments about her appearance that had nothing to do with military service, the way he'd made it clear that her future in the Army depended on her willingness to provide the kind of special cooperation that had destroyed countless military careers. Staff Sergeant. Agent Reynolds paused the recording. Can you describe Colonel Brennan's behavior during this conversation? Ma'am, the colonel began by discussing legitimate training issues, but within 5 minutes he'd shifted to personal comments about my appearance and suggestions that my evaluation would be influenced by how well I understood the need for loyalty to my commanding officer. When I attempted to redirect the conversation to professional matters, he made it clear that he viewed our relationship as extending beyond normal military duties. Agent Reynolds made a note and continued the recording. Brennan's voice became more explicit. Elena, you're a smart woman. Smart enough to understand that advancement in the Army requires more than just technical competence. It requires understanding how to work with your superiors, how to show appreciation for the opportunities you've been given. Elena's recorded response was carefully professional. Sir, I believe my performance record demonstrates my commitment to excellence in all aspects of military service. I'm not talking about performance reports. Brennan's voice carried a note of irritation. I'm talking about personal loyalty, the kind of loyalty that ensures mutual benefit for both parties involved. Agent Reynolds stopped the recording. How did you interpret that statement? Ma'am, based on the context of our previous interactions and his subsequent behavior, I understood Colonel Brennan to be suggesting that my career advancement would depend on my willingness to provide sexual favors in exchange for positive evaluations and recommendations. Major Chun looked up from her notes. Staff Sergeant, did Colonel Brennan ever make explicit sexual demands during these recorded conversations? Elena met her gaze steadily. Ma'am, Colonel Brennan was careful to use language that could be interpreted as discussing professional relationships if his words were taken out of context. But the pattern of behavior, the private settings he chose for these conversations, and his escalating physical contact made his intentions clear to anyone who'd experienced this type of harassment before. Agent Reynolds activated the second recording, dated October 8th. Elena's voice again. Sir, I've completed the fitness assessment schedules you requested. Brennan. Good, but there are other assessments we need to discuss. Assessments of your attitude, your commitment to this unit, your understanding of how things work in the real Army. The conversation continued for 12 minutes with Brennan, becoming increasingly explicit about what he expected from Elena in exchange for her continued military career. At one point, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I've been very patient with you, Elena, more patient than most commanders would be with a soldier who doesn't seem to understand the importance of gratitude. But my patience isn't unlimited. When Agent Reynolds paused this recording, Elena provided context for each veiled threat, each suggestion that her refusal to comply would result in negative counseling statements, poor evaluations, and eventual separation from the Army, under circumstances that would make future employment difficult. The third recording was the most damaging. Dated October 12th, just 3 days before the parade ground incident, it captured a conversation in which Brennan had dropped most pretense of discussing professional matters. Elena, I'm going to be very clear with you because subtlety doesn't seem to be working. Your evaluation is due next week. Your promotion board meets next month. I have significant influence over both outcomes. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you want that influence working for you or against you. Elena's recorded voice remained steady. Sir, I believe my performance record speaks for itself. Your performance record is irrelevant if your commanding officer has concerns about your attitude, your reliability, your commitment to unit cohesion. Those concerns become part of your permanent file, Elena. They follow you for the rest of your career. The threat was clear, unambiguous, and delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd made similar threats many times before. Agent Reynolds let the recording continue as Brennan outlined exactly what kind of attitude adjustment would be required to avoid those negative reports. When the recording ended, The conference room fell silent. Agent Reynolds and Major Chun exchanged glances that suggested they'd heard enough to understand the context for what had happened on the parade ground. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Agent Reynolds said, "Did you report any of these conversations through your chain of command?" Elena reached into her folder and produced a stack of documents. "Ma'am, I filed formal complaints with the battalion executive, officer, the brigade inspector general, and the Post Equal Opportunity Office. I also requested transfer to another unit, citing personal conflicts with my current command structure." Major Chun reviewed the paperwork Elena had provided. "What responses did you receive to these complaints?" "Ma'am, the battalion executive officer informed me that my concerns were noted, but that no action would be taken without corroborating evidence. The Inspector General's office conducted what they described as a preliminary inquiry, which consisted of asking Colonel Brennan whether he'd engaged in inappropriate behavior toward subordinates. When he denied the allegations, the matter was closed with a finding of unsubstantiated. My transfer request was denied due to critical personnel shortages." Agent Reynolds frowned. "Did anyone suggest that you document these interactions for future reference?" "Yes, ma'am. Sergeant First Class Park advised me that audio recordings would provide the kind of evidence that might be taken more seriously by investigating authorities. He also warned me that Colonel Brennan's behavior would likely escalate if he felt that his authority was being challenged through official channels." The next hour was spent reviewing the events of October 15th in detail. Elena described the awards ceremony, Brennan's speech about military values, and the moment when he'd called her aside for what he claimed would be a discussion about her evaluation. "When Colonel Brennan placed his hand on your arm," Agent Reynolds asked, "what was your assessment of the threat he represented?" Elena considered her answer carefully. "Ma'am, based on 8 months of escalating harassment, explicit threats about my career if I didn't comply with his demands, and his attempt to physically control my movement toward an isolated location, I assessed that Colonel Brennan intended to force me into a situation where he could continue his harassment without witnesses. When he refused to release me after I gave him multiple opportunities to do so, I used the minimum force necessary to escape from his control." Major Chun leaned forward. "Staff Sergeant, you're trained in hand-to-hand combat. You could have disabled Colonel Brennan without breaking his arm. Why did you choose to inflict that level of injury?" Elena met her gaze directly. "Ma'am, with respect, I used exactly the amount of force required to make Colonel Brennan release his grip and prevent him from continuing to physically control my movement. The fracture was a result of his refusal to let go when I applied the armbar technique. If he had released me when I first asked, no injury would have occurred." Agent Reynolds made a note. "Were there witnesses to the physical altercation?" "Yes. M.A. Approximately 50 soldiers were still in the area after the formation was dismissed. Corporal Santos and Sergeant First Class Park were both close enough to observe the entire interaction." "Have you spoken with any of these potential witnesses since the incident?" Elena shook her head. "No, ma'am. Sergeant Park advised me to avoid discussing the case with anyone except investigating authorities and legal counsel." Agent Reynolds gathered her notes and prepared to conclude the interview. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, is there anything else you want to add to your statement?" Elena was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything that had led to this point, the months of harassment, the failed complaints, the impossible choice between her dignity and her career. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every woman who'd ever been told to accept abuse for the sake of institutional stability. "Ma'am, I want it understood that I never wanted this situation to escalate to physical confrontation. I tried to handle Colonel Brennan's harassment through proper channels, following every regulation and procedure designed to protect soldiers from abuse by their superiors. When those systems failed, when it became clear that no help was coming through official channels, I was forced to choose between submitting to sexual coercion or defending myself. She paused, thinking about her grandmother's words about dignity and courage. I chose to defend myself, ma'am. I would make the same choice again under the same circumstances. Agent Reynolds nodded and turned off her recorder. Thank you, staff. Sergeant, we'll be conducting interviews with potential witnesses over the next several days. You'll be notified when we're ready to proceed with the next phase of this investigation. As Elena left the Seed building, she found Maria and David waiting for her in the parking lot. Their presence was a violation of the orders to avoid discussing the case, but she was grateful for the reminder that she wasn't facing this battle alone. How did it go? Maria asked. Elena looked back at the building where her future was being decided by people who'd never met Colonel Brennan, never experienced his particular brand of harassment, never faced the choice between career and dignity. That had defined her military service for the past 8 months. It went exactly the way it needed to go, she said. Now we wait to see if the truth is enough. The phone call came at 0637 on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 weeks after the incident that had transformed Elena from an anonymous staff sergeant into the center of the largest command climate investigation Fort Braxton had seen in 2 decades. Agent Reynolds' voice carried a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal relief that Elena had learned to interpret as good news during the long weeks of waiting. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I'm calling to inform you that the Article 32 hearing for Colonel Brennan has been scheduled for December 15th. You'll be required to testify, but I wanted you to know that the investigating officer has recommended that all charges proceed to court-martial. Elena sat up in bed, fully awake despite the early hour. What charges, ma'am? Sexual harassment, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and assault. The assault charge relates to his physical contact with you on October 15th. The investigating officer determined that his actions constituted unlawful restraint under Article 87 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. While she'd been placed on administrative leave pending investigation of her actions, Colonel Brennan was facing court-martial for the behavior that had forced her to defend herself. What about the other complainants? Specialist Rodriguez and Sergeant Williams have both agreed to testify about their experiences with Colonel Brennan. Their cases will be presented as evidence of a pattern of misconduct that supports your allegations. Additionally, we've identified 3 other soldiers who witnessed incidents but were afraid to report them while Brennan remained in command. Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for herself, but for the institution she'd served faithfully despite its failures. Ma'am, what's my status during the court-martial proceedings? You'll remain on administrative duty pending the outcome of the trial. However, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison has requested that you be reassigned to her staff as an advisor on command. Climate issues and harassment prevention training. It appears the brigade commander is taking a comprehensive approach to addressing the systemic problems this case has revealed. After Agent Reynolds hung up, Elena sat in her kitchen drinking coffee and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a staff sergeant whose career was being threatened by a predatory commanding officer. Today, she was being asked to help design systems that would prevent other soldiers from facing the same impossible choices she'd confronted. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first 2 weeks after the incident had been the worst, filled with whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, media attention that painted her alternatively as a hero or a villain, and the constant uncertainty about whether her decision to fight back would ultimately destroy the career she'd worked 7 years to build. The turning point had come when Specialist Carmen Rodriguez approached Agent Reynolds with a story that mirrored Elena's experience in disturbing detail. Rodriguez was 22 years old, new to the Army, and had been enduring Brennan's harassment for 6 months without knowing how to report it or whom to trust with her concerns. She'd witnessed Elena's confrontation with Brennan on the parade ground and realized that someone was finally standing up to a man who'd made her military service a daily exercise in humiliation and fear. Rodriguez's testimony had opened floodgates that revealed the scope of Brennan's misconduct. Sergeant First Class Jennifer Williams came forward with evidence of harassment that dated back 3 years, including text messages and emails that Brennan had been careless enough to send from his official accounts. 2 junior officers provided statements about inappropriate comments and unwanted contact during official functions. A former clerk revealed that she'd requested transfer to another unit after Brennan had cornered her in his office and made explicit demands for sexual favors in exchange for favorable work assignments. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of systematic abuse of authority that had gone unchecked for years, enabled by a command structure that prioritized institutional reputation over individual justice and protected predators because challenging their behavior was more difficult than transferring their victims. Elena's case had become the catalyst for a reckoning that extended far beyond one corrupt colonel. The Inspector General had launched a comprehensive review of complaint procedures, finding that dozens of harassment cases had been inadequately investigated or summarily dismissed over the past 5 years. The brigade commander had instituted new policies requiring all harassment complaints to be investigated by personnel outside the accused's direct chain of command. Most significantly, Elena's recordings had prompted an Army-wide review of evidence standards, leading to new guidelines that gave greater weight to contemporaneous documentation and victim statements. The personal cost had been significant. Elena's name and face had appeared in national media coverage that focused more on the dramatic image of a female soldier breaking her commanding officer's arm than on the systematic failures that had made such a confrontation necessary. Some coverage portrayed her as a feminist icon standing up against military sexism. Other reports suggested she was a dangerous example of military discipline breaking down. Neither narrative captured the complexity of a situation where institutional failures had forced an individual to choose between accepting abuse and defending herself. The support from her fellow soldiers had been overwhelming and unexpected. Maria had organized a letter-writing campaign that generated testimonials from over 100 soldiers who described Elena's professionalism, integrity, and leadership. David had provided detailed documentation of Elena's exemplary service record and the proper procedures she'd followed in attempting to report Brennan's behavior through official channels. Even soldiers who'd never worked directly with Elena had reached out to express support for her courage in confronting a problem that many had witnessed but felt powerless to address. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had emerged as Elena's strongest advocate within the command structure, using her position as acting battalion commander to ensure that Elena's case received fair treatment and that the investigation proceeded without interference from officers who might have been compromised by their relationships with Brennan. Morrison had also spearheaded efforts to reform training programs, adding comprehensive modules on recognizing and reporting harassment while emphasizing the obligation of all soldiers to protect their comrades from abuse. The court-martial proceedings would be the final test of whether the system could deliver justice when forced to confront its own failures. Elena knew that Brennan's defense would likely focus on attacking her credibility, questioning her motives, and arguing that her response to his behavior was disproportionate to the threat he represented. Military defense attorneys were skilled at exploiting the institutional bias that often viewed female complainants with suspicion, while giving male officers the benefit of doubt. But Elena also knew that she possessed something her predecessors in similar cases had often lacked: comprehensive documentation, corroborating witnesses, and evidence of a pattern of misconduct that would be difficult for any defense team to explain away. More importantly, she had the support of an investigating officer who'd taken her allegations seriously, a command structure that had been forced to acknowledge its failures, and a growing movement within the military to address harassment as a readiness issue rather than a personal problem. On a cold December morning, Elena stood outside the courtroom where Colonel Marcus Brennan would face the consequences of 8 months of systematic harassment and abuse of authority. She wore her dress uniform, her ribbons and badges reflecting 7 years of dedicated service to an institution that had failed to protect her, but was finally prepared to hold her abuser accountable. Maria and David flanked her as they entered the building, their presence a reminder that she'd never been fighting this battle alone. Behind them came a procession of soldiers whose careers had been touched by Brennan's misconduct. Women and men who'd found the courage to speak truth to power because one staff sergeant had refused to accept that harassment was the price of military service. The court-martial would last 3 days. Brennan's defense attorneys would argue that his behavior had been misunderstood, taken out of context, blown out of proportion by a subordinate who'd misinterpreted professional guidance as personal harassment. They would suggest that Elena's response had been motivated by ambition rather than self-defense, that she'd seen an opportunity to advance her career by destroying a superior officer's reputation. Elena's testimony would be measured, professional, and devastating. She would describe 8 months of escalating harassment with the clinical precision that had made her an excellent instructor and the moral clarity that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her military career. She would play the recordings that captured Brennan's voice, making explicit demands for sexual favors, threatening retaliation for non-compliance, and revealing the calculating mindset of a predator who'd grown comfortable operating with impunity. When the defense suggested that her recordings had been taken out of context, Elena would provide that context with the kind of detail that comes from living through every moment she'd documented. When they argued that her physical response had been excessive, she would explain the tactical assessment that had led her to use exactly the force necessary to escape from unlawful restraint by a superior officer who'd already demonstrated his willingness to abuse his authority. The verdict, when it came, would validate every choice Elena had made from the moment she decided to start recording her interactions with Brennan. Guilty on all charges. Dismissal from the Army, forfeiture of all pay and allowances. Confinement for 18 months. More importantly, the verdict would send a message throughout the military that abuse of authority would no longer be tolerated, that victims of harassment could expect justice rather than retaliation, and that the institution was finally prepared to live up to the values it claimed to represent. But that victory lay in the future. Standing outside the courtroom on that cold December morning, Elena was thinking not about vindication or justice or the broader implications of her case. She was thinking about her grandmother's words about dignity and courage, about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform, about the soldiers who would serve after her, and the example she was setting for their future. Elena Vasquez had joined the Army to serve something larger than herself. 7 years later, she was about to discover that sometimes the greatest service comes not from following orders, but from having the courage to break the silence that enables injustice to flourish. 2 years later, the auditorium at the Army War College was packed with officers from across the military, their faces reflecting the kind of focused attention that comes when someone is speaking truth about subjects too long avoided. Elena stood at the podium in her dress uniform, now bearing the rank of Sergeant First Class, addressing an audience of colonels and general officers about command climate and the institutional changes that had followed what media outlets had dubbed the Fort Braxton Incident. "The question I'm asked most frequently," Elena said, her voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium, "is whether I regret my decision to physically defend myself against Colonel Brennan's assault. The answer is simple. My only regret is that institutional failures made such a confrontation necessary." In the audience, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, now Colonel Morrison, nodded approvingly. She'd been instrumental in developing the new harassment prevention protocols that had been implemented Army-wide following Brennan's court-martial. The changes went far beyond policy updates. They represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached issues of abuse, accountability, and institutional culture. Elena continued her presentation, outlining the comprehensive reforms that had emerged from her case. Independent investigation units now handled all harassment complaints, removing the conflict of interest that had allowed predators like Brennan to escape accountability through personal relationships and professional loyalties. Mandatory training programs emphasize not just recognition and reporting of harassment, but the obligation of all soldiers to intervene when they witnessed abuse of authority. Most significantly, victim advocacy services had been expanded to provide legal support, counseling, and career protection for soldiers who came forward with allegations against superior officers. The changes we've implemented aren't just about preventing harassment, Elena explained to her audience of senior leaders. They're about restoring trust in the institution and ensuring that soldiers can focus on their mission without fear that their own leaders represent a threat to their safety and dignity. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. After her presentation, Elena was approached by a young captain whose nameplate read Torres. She was probably 26, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested she'd never had to choose between her career and her safety. "Ma'am," Captain Torres said, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. I entered the Army after your case became public, and knowing that soldiers like you were willing to fight for accountability made me confident that this was an institution I could serve with pride." Elena smiled, remembering her own idealism as a young soldier. "Captain, the real test isn't whether someone like me was willing to fight. The real test is whether the institution learned from what happened and built systems that make such fights unnecessary. Do you think we've succeeded in that?" Torres asked. Elena considered the question carefully. "We've made progress. Significant progress. But institutional change is a process, not an event. Every leader in this auditorium has a responsibility to ensure that the reforms we've implemented become part of the culture, not just items on a policy checklist." 5 years later, Elena stood in her dress blue uniform outside the Pentagon, preparing for a meeting with the Secretary of the Army about expanding the harassment prevention programs she'd helped develop to other branches of the military. At 35, she held the rank of Master Sergeant and served as the senior enlisted advisor for the Army's Sexual Harassment Assault Response and Prevention Program. The intervening years had brought recognition she'd never sought but had learned to use effectively. Time magazine had named her one of their Persons of the Year in a feature about military reform. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus had honored her with their Courage and Service Award. Harvard's Kennedy School had invited her to teach a seminar on institutional change and moral courage. But the recognition Elena valued most came from the letters she received from young soldiers, women and men who told her that her example had given them courage to report harassment, to trust that the system would protect them, to believe that their service mattered to an institution that was finally learning to live up to its stated values. The meeting at the Pentagon went well. The Secretary of the Army, a former combat commander who'd taken office pledging to continue the reforms initiated after Elena's case, approved funding for a joint service pilot program that would extend the Army's harassment prevention model to the Navy, Air Force, and Marines. "Master Sergeant Vasquez," the Secretary said as the meeting concluded, "when you broke Colonel Brennan's arm in front of 240 soldiers, did you imagine it would lead to this?" Elena thought about the question seriously. "Sir, when I made the decision to defend myself that morning, I was thinking about survival my own and that of the soldiers who would come after me. I never imagined that one moment of resistance would become a catalyst for systemic change, but I'm grateful that it has." The sun was setting behind the hills of Northern Virginia, casting golden light across the garden where Elena had planted reminders of every important place and person in her life. The roses from her grandmother's memory bloomed alongside lavender. That recalled the fields near Fort Braxton, where everything had changed on a morning that seemed like both yesterday and a lifetime ago. Elena thought about the young captain, who just called from Germany, facing the same impossible choices that had once seemed to define Elena's own future. But the captain wouldn't face those choices alone, wouldn't have to choose between career and dignity without institutional support, wouldn't have to break anyone's arm to make her voice heard. That was the real victory, not the court-martial that had ended Brennan's career, not the recognition Elena had received for her courage, not even the systemic reforms that had emerged from her confrontation with institutional failure. The real victory was measured in the conversations that would never happen, the complaints that would be taken seriously, the young soldiers who would serve with dignity intact because someone had been willing to pay the price for change. As darkness fell over the garden, Elena made her way back inside, past the study where she continued her work on military ethics and institutional reform, past the living room where photos chronicled a career that had taken unexpected turns but had never strayed from the values her grandmother had taught her. In her bedroom, Elena carefully hung up the civilian clothes she'd worn that day and reached for the small wooden box where she kept her grandmother's silver cross, the same cross that had pressed against her chest on the morning she'd faced Colonel Brennan's final attempt to force her submission. The cross was tarnished now, worn smooth by decades of handling, but it still carried the weight of every lesson about courage and dignity that had shaped Elena's understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. Tomorrow she would wear it again as she continued the work that had grown from a single moment of resistance, the work of building institutions worthy of the people who serve them. Elena's story had become part of military history, studied in leadership courses and cited in policy documents. But for Elena herself, it remained intensely personal, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the failures within our own institutions, and that victory is measured not in territory gained but in lives protected and dignity preserved. The phone calls would continue to come from young soldiers facing their own moments of choice. Elena would continue to answer them, providing guidance and support and the reminder that courage, while never easy, is always possible. The work of reform would continue, adapting to new challenges and new failures, but never abandoning the principle that institutions must serve the people within them rather than protecting the systems that enable abuse. And somewhere in a military installation around the world, a young soldier facing harassment would remember the story of Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, who broke her commanding officer's arm in front of 240 soldiers rather than submit to abuse, and would find the courage to speak up, to stand tall, to demand better from an institution that had promised to protect her. That soldier would discover what Elena had learned 20 years earlier on a parade ground at Fort Braxton: that dignity defended is never lost, that courage shared multiplies itself across time and distance, and that sometimes the greatest service to your country comes not from following orders, but from having the strength to break the silence that enables injustice to flourish. The silver cross caught the lamplight as Elena placed it on her knitstand, a reminder of her grandmother's words that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her military career. You carry the strength of every woman who came before you, every woman who fought so you could stand where you're standing. Elena had stood. She had fought. She had won. And in doing so, she had ensured that the women and men who came after her would stand on firmer ground, protected by systems built through sacrifice and sustained by the understanding that true strength lies not in the ability to endure injustice, but in the courage to confront it. The story that had begun with violence on a parade ground had become a legacy of institutional change, personal courage, and the enduring truth that individual actions, when guided by unwavering principles, can transform the world in ways both profound and permanent. Elena smiled as she turned off the light, thinking about the young captain in Germany who would sleep a little easier tonight, knowing that someone understood her struggle and someone had fought to ensure she wouldn't face it alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new chances to prove that the values worth defending are the values worth living. Outside her window, the lights of Washington, D.C. sparkled in the distance, the seat of a government and military that had learned slowly and sometimes painfully that strength comes not from the suppression of dissent, but from the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and build better systems from the lessons of failure. Elena Vasquez had served her country in many ways over 22 years of military service and 15 years of civilian advocacy. But perhaps her greatest service had been a single moment of refusal, the refusal to accept that harassment was the price of military service, that predators deserved protection more than their victims, that institutional stability mattered more than individual dignity. In refusing to submit to Colonel Marcus Brennan's abuse, Elena had refused to accept a military culture that failed to live up to its stated values. In breaking his arm in front of 240 soldiers, she had broken the silence that had protected abusers and punished victims for generations, and in standing trial for her actions, in facing the consequences of her choice with unwavering commitment to the truth, she had proven that sometimes the most patriotic act a soldier can perform is the decision to hold their institution accountable to the principles it claims to represent. The strength of every woman who came before, the courage of every soldier who would come after, and the enduring power of individual conscience to transform institutional culture, all of it lived on in the legacy of a staff sergeant who'd faced an impossible choice and had chosen dignity over submission, truth over silence, courage over compliance. The colonel tried to harm her until she broke his arm in front of 240 soldiers.